in an off-year election and literally rejected what Republicans, elected officials were trying to do, what special interests were trying to do in the state, which is basically weaken voters' rights, weaken the rights of voters in the state. When you think about how women in Ohio are going to they're going to vote to decide if women in Ohio is going to have the right, the freedom to make a decision on their reproductive right, to make a decision on their health care. So this is, again, a win for our democracy.
It is physically painful listening to Corinne Diversity Hire try to get through a sentence. And I'm not even actually talking about her abuse of the word literally there. I actually more want to focus on what actually did happen in Ohio with my friend Josh Hammer of the Josh Hammer Show. Josh, okay, buddy, obviously I'm hard on the right often. I feel we are way too complacent, way too lazy, way too soft, way too weak, way too often. We had an election in Ohio, an important election. Everyone's supposedly mad about Joe Biden and the Democrats. And then we had an off-year election and Republicans did what they always do, and they sat at home while Democrats went and voted.
Yeah, no, look, Jesse, always great to be with you. I mean, that's exactly what happened. So issue 1 was voted down by a 57-43 margin at the Ohio ballot box last Tuesday. Now, it's important to note that the word abortion, the word life, none of that was mentioned anywhere in the actual text of issue 1. The actual issue that was voted on, so kind of backtrack a little, Ohio's voting on a separate ballot box referendum this November. Ohioans are going to go to the polls to decide whether or not they want to legalize abortion in Ohio, California style, put in a right up through the second, third trimester, who knows? I mean, it would really be quite horrific if that passes. But in Ohio, currently, you actually only need a 50+1 bare majority of voters to support a referendum to amend the state constitution. So issue 1, what the voters voted on, would have raised the threshold for amending the Constitution from 50+1 to 60%, not even 2/3, just 60. And that is actually what lost. But because of the context of this vote that is to come in November, both sides, the pro-life side and the pro-abortion side, treated issue 1 as a proxy. And, unfortunately, it did lose by a margin of 57-43. That doesn't necessarily mean that Ohioans are going to vote to legalize abortion California style this November. Pro-lifers, our side, can absolutely still win on that. Now, having spoken with a number of friends who are on the ground there in Ohio, so some pro-life, solid right-wing friends, many of them are feeling kind of gloomy and somewhat doomer at this time after this vote. But, it's time to kind of try at least to win. I mean, we can win this fight in Ohio if we put our minds to it, if the dollars start flowing in. The pro-life side was outspent 3-1 on issue 1, which is obviously partially why we lost. Although I think another reason why issue 1 lost is kind of just human psychology. I mean, think about what the status quo is. I mean, status quo bias is a thing. I mean, in order to vote to change something, you have to first be persuaded that the status quo is wrong. And the status quo in Ohio was 50+1 to amend. So, yeah, tough loss, but we're not out of the game yet. We're going to have another chance this November.
You wrote a piece talking about changing hearts and minds when it comes to abortion. There's no question about that. We have to, as you just alluded to, change the status quo. We have to change what people have normalized, what has sadly been normalized in this country. So how do we begin?
Yeah, Jesse, this is a this is a big issue for me. I know it's a big issue for you too. I've been passionate about this issue for a very long time. My first year of law school, I founded the Law Students for Life student group because it had been previously moribund. I have marched for marches for life, in sub-zero temperatures in Chicago, for example, where I went to law school. I mean, I've been passionate about this issue for a very, very long time. And, overturning Roe versus Wade, the Dobbs decision last year, was a tremendous, tremendous celebration. But, the point of my column, especially in the aftermath of this loss in Ohio, was basically just trying to remind people, especially my own side, our side, the pro-life side, that it took 49 years. I mean, it took way too long, but it took 49 years for Roe versus Wade to finally be overturned in the Dobbs case. And the notion that we're going to, abolish abortion in America, which is the obvious ultimate culmination of the pro-life movement, that's certainly what I support. The idea that we're going to get there anytime soon, it's fanciful. It's obviously not going to happen. This unfortunately, for being sober-minded here, is going to be a very long slog. And a lot of this has to do with what you asked, which is the actual work of convincing people as to the wrongness of abortion. Now, there are some wonderful organizations that are trying to do exactly that. So, for example, I wrote this column partially as a column, of course, but partially also as part of a speech that I gave this past weekend out in Utah for a pro-life state lawmakers summit sponsored by Live Action. That's Lila Rose's group. They do phenomenal work. And one of the things that Live Action does so well, they're very prolific on social media, whether it's Instagram, Twitter. They have these viral videos just talking about the nature of the unborn child and how that changes across the entire gestational period. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, Jesse, that when you actually when you explain to people what an abortion is, whether it involves the actual dismemberment of limbs, the suction of the human brain, I mean, just loathsome, barbaric, atrocious stuff, increasingly, of course, at later stages of a pregnancy. When you actually explain this to people, when you explain that a new DNA code, a new genetic code is actually formed at the fertilization of an egg, that an embryo is therefore inherently worthy of protection under a law. When you actually explain this using science, for instance, then in my own capacity, I found that some people can be persuaded, but it's going to be a very, very hard, long slog. We have to start talking about this sort of thing in K through 12 education, by the way. North Dakota, it was either earlier this year or last year, but North Dakota passed a bill where they actually took from that group Live Action. Live Action has this thing called Baby Olivia, and they track Baby Olivia throughout the entire pregnancy. And North Dakota basically adopted that into its curriculum. So students in their public schools in North Dakota learn about Baby Olivia and how Baby Olivia changes throughout an entire pregnancy. That's what it's going to involve. It's going to involve a lot of difficult conversations, but also just education, frankly.
So let's have a talk. Here was Donald Trump talking about abortion.
And some of your allies on Capitol Hill say that they want to introduce legislation when it comes to banning abortion. If they send it to your desk, would you sign it?
Some people are at 6 weeks. Some people are at 3 weeks,
where's
2
President
weeks.
Trump?
President Trump is going to make a determination what he thinks is great for the country and what's fair for the country. But the fact that I was able to terminate Roe v. Wade after 50 years of trying, they worked for 50 years. I've never seen anything like it. They worked, and I was so honored to have done it. We are in a very good negotiating position right now, only because of what I was able to do. And remember this, again, you talk about radicalism. People that will kill a baby in the 9th month or the 8th month or the 7th month or after the baby is born, they're the radicals, not the pro-life.
I just want to give you...
Josh, that's a good answer. Kind of, right? That's a good answer.
It's an okay answer. I wouldn't say it's a great answer. So, some people, Jesse, on our side have this idea that overturning Roe versus Wade was all about just returning it to the states. And, their confusion, I think, in that respect is somewhat justified because our side has not actually always been clear about this. But in many respects, we actually, to an extent, have been clear. I mean, the Republican Party platform going back as far as 1984, I believe, the Reagan-Bush re-election ticket, has called for the abolition of abortion in America. And the claim, which is the claim that I have come to be a proponent of, at least over the past 3-4 years or so, is actually that as a matter of constitutional interpretation, if we want to go there, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which calls for the equal protection of all persons under law, properly construed, that actually should be applied to unborn persons who we now know, due to science and XYZ, are actual persons. So therefore, whether it's Congress legislating under the 14th Amendment Section 5 or the Supreme Court just getting 14th Amendment constitutional interpretation correctly, in theory, abortion should actually be abolished in America today. So having said all that as context, I think this idea that the federal government cannot get involved, Congress cannot legislate, the president cannot do anything, I think that's very silly. Now, it is simply true as a matter of practical day-to-day political reality that for the time being, most of these fights absolutely are transpiring at the state level. That's totally true. And, given that at this current time in the year 2023, the remedy for Alabama is not going to be the same remedy for California. That's just the nature of federalism. But we have to be working up towards the ultimate federalization, the ultimate nationalization of this issue. I think back, Jesse, if I can make a provocative analogy, to Abraham Lincoln and the debate over chattel slavery, which in many ways was the predecessor to abortion from my perspective. So, Going back then, I mean, slavery was what abortion is today. It is the treatment of human beings as nothing other than disposable property, whether it was the Dred Scott decision in 1857 or Roe versus Wade in 1973. Both of these horrible practices were at one point in American history called a constitutional quote unquote right. And from that perspective, I think back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, where time and again, Stephen Douglas would say, oh, popular sovereignty, let the people decide. If this state, if this territory wants to legalize slavery, so be it. It's not your decision to make. And Lincoln came over the top and said, no, it's actually not true that there are some things that we should simply leave to a majoritarian vote, to the direct democracy vote. There are some things that scream a solution on a broader level because it implicates fundamental human rights, fundamental inherent human dignity, and substantive justice, what is right and what is wrong. So ultimately, this cannot be resolved at the state level abortion, even though for the time being it is. So that's why I think what we heard from the former president there was an only okay answer, because I think he misses that broader point.
Josh, I love it, buddy. Keep going. Come back soon.
You bet.
I have great news. If you enjoyed that, I have a YouTube channel you can subscribe to. Whatever I do, it'll be right there on YouTube. So go subscribe today.